Hello, my name is Niki Ashton. I'm the MP for Churchill, Keewatin-Niukiski, and Deputy Critic for Indigenous and Northern Affairs with the NDP. And I'm proud to be standing here with my colleague, Lori Idlout, the MP for Nunavut and Critic for Northern and Indigenous Services. We are here to talk about how the inflation crisis is hitting Northern and Indigenous communities hard. Northern and Indigenous communities already faced a higher cost of living. But because of the inflation crisis, the situation has become even worse. We are here to call on the Liberals to step up and take action in support of Northern and Indigenous people. A few weeks ago, Red Sucker Lake First Nation in our constituency was in the news because a 15-year-old took his own life in his own schoolyard. The chief of Red Sucker Lake was clear that the mental health crisis in his community is deeply connected to the fact that people can barely afford food and basic necessities. We have heard many people reach out to our offices, on social media, in our communities, talk about the way in which they are struggling in a way that they haven't or didn't as much before. We must be clear that Canada doesn't just have an inequality crisis. Canada doesn't just have an inflation crisis. We have an inequality crisis. And nowhere is that more obvious than in Northern and Indigenous communities. Yesterday, I was up in Parliament talking about how corporate Canada is raking it in. Royal Bank is just taking over another bank. We know that Loblaws, one of the biggest supermarket chains in our country, has announced that their profits are up by 30%. We also know that the biggest corporations in our country haven't paid $30 billion in taxes that they should have normally paid. And the reality is that those profits are on the backs of people, working people, people on fixed incomes. It is time that we take action. We need to reform the Nutrition North program so funding goes directly to people, not big box stores. We need to make sure that we're lowering prices in the North by removing the GST on home heating and make targeted investments to subsidize fuel costs that are off the charts for essential transportation in Northern and Indigenous communities. Let's talk a bit about some of those prices. Shamattawa First Nation, $3.10 a litre for fuel. To Dooley Lake, $3.09 per litre. Poplar River First Nation, just around $3 a litre. Churchill, $2.60 a litre. War Lake, $2.56 a litre. York Landing, $2.35 a litre. Here I have a picture of a gas receipt from Pucketawagan First Nation, where a litre of gas is at $2.89. People cannot afford to live with these prices. People have also reached out about the crisis level when it comes to basic foods. Here we have from Cross Lake, pork side ribs, $24.34. And if we look at some of the prices compared to, say, Ottawa, you'd find the same for about $9.46. Another picture from Cross Lake. We have chicken breasts, $28.96. Here in Ottawa, you might find it for $12 or even $10. We have frozen pizzas, something that so many families rely on. In Shamattawa, over $12 a box. Here in Ottawa, you'd find that for $5.88. And here, in so many communities where clean drinking water is not available, we have 1 liter bottle of water in Shamattawa First Nation for $7.09. Here in Ottawa, a 4-liter bottle of clean drinking water is sold for $1.99. I would now like to pass the mic on to my colleague, Lori Idlout, to share the very difficult reality in her part of the country as well.
MP Niki Ashton, and I share the same sentiments about the great work that you as my colleague do, and it is an honor to share this release with you about the concerns of inflation that has existed in our territories for much longer than what we've been seeing in Canada currently. I completely and wholeheartedly agree that the Nutrition North program needs to have an overhaul. For example, Northmart took in over 157 million in net earnings, an increase of 9.7% from 2020. The Northmart president and CEO received over 5 million in compensation for 2021, on top of the nearly 2.7 million in compensation they received in 2020. Now, for me to talk about the Nutrition North program, which to me is a subsidy for the Northmart and other for-profit corporations. In 2022 and 2023, the retail subsidy has a budget of 131.3 million. This budget increases by roughly 5% each year in an attempt to keep pace with population, growth, inflation, and the high cost of operating in isolated northern communities. An additional 36 million will be spent, we're told, on the Harvesters Support Program, which when I've heard from Nunavut about this program, they didn't even know existed. For this program, we are going to need to see improvements. I wanted to do the same thing that my colleague Nikki has done and share some food prices that exist in Nunavut. For example, Campbell's soup, which is not in here, the Frito-Lay pack, which is $33.69 in Nunavut. In Ottawa is $10.99. A pack of tomatoes in the same photo, which has 4 tomatoes in one bag, is $8.19 versus $1.77 in Ottawa. For apples per kilogram in Nunavut is $6.39 versus $5.49 in Ottawa. And finally, a canned tuna is $9.79 in Nunavut versus $2.29 in Ottawa. One of the stories that I wanted to share very quickly from my visit to Arviat earlier this year that was quite compelling was from a hunter named Peter Alarer, who told me that Nutrition North needs to improve because it's not working the way it is. And he said, if it were to improve, here is how it could be expressed. Sorry, I'm finding. He said to me, one bullet could provide for 200 to 300 pounds of meat. If this program were to better support individuals, more families would be fed. Unfortunately, that is not what is happening. I will give it back to Nikki for some more information.
Thank you, Lori. I think we can all agree that the numbers that you've heard today are shocking and unacceptable. But unfortunately, they are the reality in many of the communities we represent, in many Indigenous and Northern communities across our country. And this demands federal action. We cannot pretend that doing nothing when it comes to corporate profiteering is actually a solution. People in Northern and Indigenous communities, and yes, across the country, are suffering. We need to make sure that the richest among us are paying their fair share so that we can reinvest that money into communities. But we also need the federal government, the Liberals, to take targeted action to support Northern and Indigenous communities. And I want to reiterate, we've heard a lot about the profits that big companies are making these days. In 2021, Northmart
took in over $157 million in net earnings, an increase of 9.7% from 2020. The Northmart president and CEO, as Lori mentioned, and I'll just reiterate, received over $5 million in compensation for 2021, on top of the nearly $2.7 million in compensation they received in 2020. All this while Northern families cannot afford the groceries they need. I also want to acknowledge that, for many communities, bringing in food on their own is something that's increasingly difficult given the high cost of fuel, the high transportation costs as well. We need to make sure that the Nutrition North program is being reviewed and is reformed given the inflation crisis impacts on Northern and Indigenous communities. And I'll turn to my colleague Lori to talk about the cost of fuel.
Kaya namin Niki, on the cost of fuel, there are almost 300 First Nations, Inuit, Métis, living in remote communities that solely rely on diesel power. Nunavut's power needs are almost entirely met through diesel, which must be delivered in bulk into the community by sea lift. The average price of diesel right now is 202.1 cents per liter, up nearly 66 cents per liter compared to last year.
And while today we focused on the cost of food and basic necessities, on home heating fuel, and the need to take action around the cost of fuel for essential needs in Northern and Indigenous communities, we can't talk about the inflation crisis and the inequality crisis without talking about the housing crisis in Northern and Indigenous communities. And we in the NDP have been very clear that the Liberals need to move on commitments around Indigenous housing in dealing with the absolute housing crisis in so many of our communities. We also know that rising construction costs threaten housing projects across Northern, rural, and remote Canada. We know that Nunavut has had to cancel many housing and infrastructure proposals because they simply cannot afford to build them. In our constituency, Pimachikamak Cree Nation, Cross Lake in Northern Manitoba has been very clear. It needs approximately 1,000 homes to meet the needs in its community. Every single First Nation that I represent is facing a housing crisis. We need to make sure that the rising costs of building supplies, which we've seen across the country, is not used as an excuse to move on dealing with the housing crisis, the long-standing housing crisis in Indigenous and Northern communities. We need to make sure that the federal government understands the extent to which Northern and Indigenous communities are in crisis at this time, on various fronts. And that is why today we are here calling on the Liberals to act, to take targeted action in support of the needs of Northern and Indigenous communities when it comes to food security and reviewing and reforming the Nutrition North program, when it comes to removing the GST off of home heating fuel, but taking also targeted action around fuel that's used for essential purposes in our communities. Northern and Indigenous communities, Northern and Indigenous peoples cannot afford to keep going down this path. We need Canada to act. We'll open it for questions now.
Then we'll start with the questions in the room. Brett, do you have any question? Reporters online, if you have any question, please use your raise hand function.
So you
notify
both
us.
mentioned Northmart. Maybe Ms. Idlout, you could talk a little bit about how a lack of competition among Northern retailers impacts prices and by extension people's quality of life.
Thank you for that question. It's good to see you in real life instead of on a TV screen. For sure, there is very minor competition. There are co-ops in our communities, but even the co-ops talk about the challenges with the Nutrition North program. I do want to highlight as well that not not only with regards to the lack of competition, but the lack of monitoring and evaluation by the Government of Canada. When I've asked questions to the Minister of Northern Affairs about when the last audit happened, how the audits happened, it was apparent that Northmart self-monitors what its pricing is. They are the only ones who receive complaints about pricing. According to the figures that have been given to us, the last audit of the Northwest Company was in 2019, and that audit was for the years 2015 to 2017. So it is clear that there needs to be a better way to ensure that Northmart is being held accountable for the program that it's delivering on behalf of the Government of Canada.
And as a follow-up, this is for either one of you. Could we get some more details about these proposed tax cuts? Would this apply only in the north? And how much money do you think it would save?
Well, first, the call around removing the 5% GST is a broader call for across the country, but we realized that it would have disproportionate application, I guess, in the north, where so many communities rely on home heating fuel, and so that's already been out there for some time. What we are looking for here today is, and what we are calling for is the Liberals to work with us, but most importantly with Northern and Indigenous communities to find a way, both in terms of food security, and we mentioned the Nutrition North program, and also on tackling the high cost of fuel, to find together for us to find ways to create solutions for Northern and Indigenous peoples right now. We know that there are government members that represent Northern and Indigenous ridings. We extend our hand out to them because we know that their constituents are facing the exact same reality. And so we also know that that the government talks a good talk on reconciliation. Reconciliation means action, and right now communities are in increasingly desperate situations. So what we're saying here today is, and we do want to put forward I know my colleague Lori Idlout is going to be putting forward a motion in her committee around this issue. But what we are certainly saying here today, it is time to get to the table and find solutions for Northern and Indigenous communities, including through existing programs like the Nutrition North program that's clearly not meeting the needs at this time.
We'll take some questions online. Please, David, go ahead. Hello, David.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead with your question.
Okay. Thank you. Questions for Lori. I'm wondering if, Lori, you could give me some specifics of how you want to see nutrition going forward.
Can you ask him to repeat the question? It was
Can you
very
repeat the
choppy.
question? You're cutting in and out, David.
I'm wondering if you can give me some specific examples of how you want to see reformed to better benefit new communities.
Thank you, David. That program definitely needs to do better on promoting the Harvester Support Grant and Community Foods Program, because the communities that I went back home to have told me that Nutrition North doesn't work, and some of the solutions that they have shared with me was for that subsidy to be available to hunters and trappers organizations. So there is definitely a disparity between what the federal government is saying and what the communities are hearing. If communities were aware that this program existed, I'm sure that they would have made sure to access the program knowing that it's available. So the program that this Nutrition North program needs to do better to make sure that it's going directly to people rather than to the for-profit corporations who are subsidized to keep making profits off the hands of Nunavut and Northerners. So I would love to see it more focused on supporting the Hunters and Trappers associations that exist in the communities.
Thank you, Lori. If I could, how about for families?
David, we're losing you. We can't hear anything.
Is it a little bit better now?
Yes.
Okay. Lori, how about for families who don't rely on harvesting for food and still rely on grocery stores for food?
That is a great question. All communities in Nunavut have Hunters and Trappers associations that can provide that country food for families that don't have harvesters in their families. These are well-known services that are provided by Hunters and Trappers associations in every community. That is why it's so critical to better support the Hunters and Trappers associations through this program.
Next question, Catherine, go ahead.
Hello. What would you say to those who argue that residents already benefit from lower tax subsidies to cover the cost?
We're still having trouble hearing you. You're cutting in and out as well.
Yeah, it's horrible the way it's done. I don't know why it's so echoey. Say it more slow. What would you say to those who argue that Northern residents already benefit from lower tax and subsidy to cover the cost you've outlined today?
Do you want to go first?
Sure. Well, I think that's an important question. I'd first of all welcome those people to come and live in the North, to live in a remote community, to live in a community that in our area is accessible only by ice roads for an increasingly shorter period of time because of climate change, who live in communities with third world housing conditions, who live in communities with some of the highest rates of unemployment in the country, who live in communities where many turn away from the kinds of healthy options that are always promoted because they simply cannot afford them. We know that some of the tax breaks offered by the federal government do not apply to Indigenous peoples to many of the people that I represent. But what could certainly make a difference is targeted investments in, and as we mentioned, food security, in broader measures like taking off a GST off of home heating fuel and addressing also the high cost of fuel for essential travel as well. In northern Manitoba right now, we have 18 communities that rely on ice roads, and people are increasingly concerned that with the cost of fuel that they won't be able to afford to get out to our major centers, whether it's Thompson or Winnipeg, to shop for cheaper and healthier food options. This is we are making this call right now because the situation is serious, but it's going to get more serious if as we go down this path. We know that the inflation crisis is continuing, and we also know that there has been talk of a recession around the corner, which will undoubtedly, as it does every time, make life worse for Indigenous and Northern peoples. So that's why we're calling on the federal government, on the Liberals, to step up and work with us in support of Northern and Indigenous peoples now.
And I would say to those same people that in this time of reconciliation, we do require services, programs, we do require more. We hear time and time again about the social indicators that exist for Indigenous peoples, for Northern residents, that we have poorer nutrition, poor education, poor everything else. And these are from years and decades of neglect of government funding. We've had liberal governments and conservative governments for years, and because of the policies that they have enforced, we continue to see Indigenous peoples and Northern residents suffering from these decisions that have lasted for decades. I also want to remind them that these programs, at most times, costing as much as they do, don't work. For example, in the Nutrition North program, where it's supposed to be flying in fresh foods, when flights are continually canceled due to weather or mechanical issues, most times those fresh foods do not arrive in the communities. Most communities I've seen end up with empty shelves because there's no food to offer, because of the program not working, because of the program, because of the weather, the extreme conditions that exist in the north. We need to make sure that we're doing better for our northern residents.
Follow up?
Yeah. How would you suggest we lower the cost of fuel without subsidizing fossil fuel companies in the same manner as nutrition?
Well, that's a critical point, and I think what we need here is a solution that focuses on the needs of individuals and communities. What we're talking about here is people that need to fill up their truck so that they can, they can travel within their community, or, like I said, on the ice roads to outside communities. We're talking about people that need to fill up their snowmobile to get out on the land. We're certainly not talking about subsidizing airlines and corporations. We know that some of this fuel is sold by stores already, like Northmart, and we think that there are ways of getting at supporting individuals and people in communities when it comes to making these purchases. I'll use the example of we know and I think it's an example that many Northern Indigenous communities know well, is many of the CERB payments that went out during the pandemic made a difference in some cases, as has been shared with me, in terms of life and death, where people were able to afford some of the necessities they need, whether it was food or fuel for, like I said, essential purposes. But what we're saying here is that, yes, absolutely, we should not be supporting corporations, but we need to find ways to direct some of these supports in effectively as Indigenous and Northern peoples struggle to afford basic necessities, including fuel for essential use.
Just very quickly also to add that Canada needs to do better to help both of our ridings to transition off of diesel, so that there is more effort towards transitioning to the use of renewable energy.
And there is no further questions, so this concludes the press conference. Ceci met fin à la conférence de presse. Merci.
Thank you.
That's it? Oh, we're done?
We're done.
Okay. Yes. Can we get a photo?
Could we get a picture?
Recording stopped.